Hello there, and welcome back. Today we'll be talking about the first two dialogues in Plato's The Trial and Death of Socrates. Those are the Euthyphro and the Apology. What I want to do in this first lecture is just go through the Euthyphro, try to summarize essentially what's going on. And then in the second part, I want to take this material and apply it to a more general theory about the source and the nature of right and wrong, called divine command theory. And then finally, in the third part, we'll get to the apology, the second dialogue. So one thing you may have noticed right off the bat is that this isn't exactly the easiest stuff to read. It's a little bit antiquated. Some of the language isn't altogether accessible, and it can be a little frustrating at times. But you need to try to get beyond that and identify the really central themes and ideas contained in the dialogue, because that stuff is interesting once you can get through the sort of surface level presentation of it. Mostly what Plato wrote were dialogues, and it's an interesting format, I think. It's not like some of the stuff we'll be reading later on in the course is just a philosopher writing, as you might expect, his ideas or her ideas in a just in a book. And the nice thing about a dialogue is that it makes it a little more lively. You've got different characters. In this dialogue, you only have two characters, but at least there's some variety there, people talking back and forth. Not many philosophers use the dialogue format. It was much more common in antiquity, in ancient Greek philosophy, and Plato was really a master of it. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint here, and you can just go through this. This isn't terribly long. It's actually going to be quite a bit shorter than some of the other videos I've already posted. I'm going to make a concerted effort to keep things a little bit more concise and of a more manageable length as we move forward. So, okay, I want to start off with a little bit of background, just about these figures, Plato and Socrates, and just to speak sort of about who they were, and to kind of orient you so that this reading is placed in its proper context. So, Socrates, oops, okay, Socrates lived from 469 BC to 399, so he died at the age of 70. In fact, he was executed by the Greeks. He's generally regarded as the founder of Western philosophy. Prior to Socrates, philosophy was really nothing like what it is today. Maybe that's a bit of an overstatement. The pre-Socratics, as they're called, or the philosophers who came before Socrates, a lot of them, at any rate, were not doing philosophy in nearly as rigorous and clear of a way. And so, with Socrates, we see a huge leap forward. And in terms of his influence, he had a profound influence on Plato. You might say that Socrates was the teacher of Plato. Socrates, came before Plato, but they lived at the same time. And Plato wrote about Socrates, and Socrates' philosophy. And so through Plato, who was writing about Socrates, Socrates managed to influence nearly all subsequent philosophers in Western philosophy. Now, Socrates himself never actually wrote anything. He just sort of wandered around the streets of Athens. He kind of just talked philosophy with anybody who would listen to him. He was a sort of well-known figure in Athens, but he never wrote anything down. So what we know about Socrates comes mainly through Plato, although other writers of the time also talk about Socrates. So Plato, then, who's written this dialogue that you're reading, Socrates is a character in the dialogue. So these conversations, as they're actually written down, didn't happen exactly the way that you're reading them. But the idea is that Plato is using a real-life person, Socrates, as a character in his dialogues, basically in an effort to share with his readers what Socrates believed. So there are interesting questions about how much of this is Plato's own ideas and thoughts, and how much of it is actually Socrates' ideas. But Plato himself lived from 428 to 348 BC, and he really did help to lay the foundation for all of Western philosophy, together with Aristotle. So as I said, Plato was a student of Socrates, and he was the teacher of Aristotle. We'll be reading Aristotle next, his Nicomachean Ethics. So the way to think about this historically is you had Socrates first, he taught Plato, and then Plato taught Aristotle. All right, so I think I may have had an opportunity to mention this already, but the Trial and Death of Socrates, that name, the name of this little book, just refers to 4 of Plato's dialogues. Plato wrote a bunch of dialogues, but these 4 are often grouped together under that name, the Trial and Death of Socrates, because together the Euthyphro, the Apology, the Crito, and the Phaedo, they tell the story of Socrates' trial and death. So in the Euthyphro, the first dialogue, what we find is Socrates, this is the way it starts, right? Socrates is outside of the courthouse prior to his trial, and he's engaged in conversation with another man named Euthyphro. So I guess it's an opportunity to mention that Plato named his dialogues generally after one of the main characters in the dialogue. So Socrates is in all of them. So none of the dialogues are named Socrates, but whoever Socrates happens to be speaking with, perhaps the most prominent character, generally gets the dialogue named after them. So this dialogue is called Euthyphro because Socrates is having a conversation with the man named Euthyphro. And here's what happens. Socrates tells him that he's at the courthouse because he, Socrates, is being prosecuted. In particular, he's been accused of not believing in the Greek gods and instead worshiping false gods. And equally important, Socrates has been accused of corrupting the youth of Athens with his own teachings. All right, and then Euthyphro tells Socrates why he's there. He says that he's at the courthouse because he, Euthyphro, has accused his own father of murder. I guess what happened was Euthyphro's father had a slave who killed somebody, and so Euthyphro's father killed the slave. Euthyphro wasn't happy about this. He thought that was wrong, and so he brought a charge of murder against his own father. So this is the way it really gets started. Euthyphro says that, well, my relatives are really mad at me. They're upset, obviously, that I'm bringing this charge against my father. He's my own father. My relatives think I'm doing something wrong by doing this. In particular, they accuse me of being impious. They accuse me of impiety. I'm not sure if you're familiar with what this word means. In fact, this dialogue is largely an attempt to determine what that word means, what it means to be impious or pious, or alternatively, what it means for an action to be pious or impious. Even though that's really the subject of the dialogue. I want to say something about. I want to make some attempt to sort of answer this question at the outset, just so that when you see the word, if you're not already familiar with it, you're not like, what the hell is that? So, roughly, conduct or an action is pious if it's righteous, something like that. We don't exactly mean morally right. It's obviously a very closely related concept, piety to rightness, and impiety is obviously closely related to wrongness, but it has a religious connotation. So, yeah, let's just stick with righteous for now. So when you see pious, think righteous. So, Euthyphro, who I guess is a kind of priest of some sort, or a religious figure of some sort, he disagrees with his relatives. He thinks that he knows what kind of behavior is pious, and that his relatives are mistaken. He basically says, my relatives are accusing me of being impious by bringing this charge against my father, but that's because they don't know what piety is. In fact, I know what it is because I'm a religious figure, and and so I know that bringing this charge against my father is pious or righteous. And Socrates is sort of happy to hear this. He says, well, that's great. If you know what it means to behave piously or righteously, then you can share this knowledge with me. And then I can use that knowledge in my own defense at my trial that I'm here at the courthouse for. So he's excited, or at least pretends to be, that Euthyphro claims to know what it means to behave righteously. So he asks Euthyphro, and this is what the entire dialogue is an attempt to answer. He asks him, what is pious and what is impious? What kind of behavior or actions are pious and what aren't? So, Euthyphro's first attempt at answering this question basically consists of this. He says, I say that the pious is to do what I'm doing now, to prosecute the wrongdoer, be it about murder or temple robbery or anything else, whether the wrongdoer is your father or your mother or anyone else. That's what it is to be pious, and not to prosecute would be impious. Okay, so I think if you reflect on this for a minute, you can see what's wrong with this definition of piety and impiety. At least what's wrong with it as an answer to Socrates' question, which, as you'll see at the top of the slide, is just a general question about what's pious and what's not. Okay? So what's wrong with it in particular is that it's not a general definition. Socrates says, you didn't tell me what the pious was, but rather you told me that what you're doing now in prosecuting your father for murder is pious. I didn't ask you to tell me one or two of the many pious actions there are, but rather I wanted to know what the form itself is that makes all pious actions pious. This word here, form, has a special meaning in Plato's philosophy, but it's not something that we're going to really delve into for the purposes of this course. Rather, I'm going to try to rephrase this general point that I have here in quotation marks in order to explain what it means without making an appeal to the special technical term, the special technical meaning of the word form. So, essentially what Socrates is saying is just, look, you gave me an example of what piety is. In particular, you said prosecuting your father for murder, even though he's your father, is pious because he's a wrongdoer and deserves to be prosecuted. So you gave me an example, but when I asked you what the pious is, I wanted you to tell me in general what it is that makes an action pious. So this definition that you've given me clearly isn't going to work. So I hope that makes sense. So, in response to Socrates, Euthyphro says, all right, here's a second attempt. here's what I mean, or here's what it means for something to be pious. Just whatever is dear to the gods. In other words, whatever the gods approve of, whatever they like or love, is pious, and whatever isn't approved of, liked, or loved by the gods is impious. So, one way of putting it is that an action that the gods approve of or like is pious, and one that they disapprove of or hate is impious. So Socrates is really happy about this, actually. He says, all right, that's great. Now you've actually answered my question. However, I think that your answer to my question is going to encounter some problems, and those will become clear once we ask what it means for something to be dear to the gods, and once we ask what the implications are of defining piety in that way. Now here's why. Socrates, he manages to get Euthyphro to admit all of the following things in the next part of the dialogue that ensues. He gets Euthyphro to grant him that the pious is the opposite of the impious. That seems pretty straightforward. Righteous behavior is the opposite of unrighteous behavior. He also gets Euthyphro to admit that the gods are in a state of discord. They're at odds with each other. I'm sure you're probably all aware that in ancient Greece, the Greeks believed in many gods. They were polytheists, Zeus and so forth, right? So you have a number of gods in the religion of ancient Greece, and they didn't all see eye to eye on things. So they disagree, they fight with one another, they're at odds about many different things, they're in a state of discord. So Euthyphro readily grants this because that's just part of it's a central element of any Greek citizens' religious commitments, that the gods disagree with one another about things. What they disagree about, in particular, has to be things like this. What's just and what's unjust, what's beautiful and what's ugly, what's good and what's bad. Now, if you look at these three categories of things, it kind of makes sense that these would be the sort of things that gods would disagree about. Why? Well, because they're just the kinds of things that we disagree about and fight about. We don't disagree about, we don't at least fight about things that aren't matters of value judgment. We don't fight about things that can easily be settled just by looking at the facts. What we disagree about are things that have to do with what we value. Those are the kinds of things we're apt to fight about as human beings. Politics, religion, ethics, aesthetics, what's beautiful and ugly. Those are all value concepts. So what Socrates is saying is that if the gods are fighting with one another, it must be these kinds of things that they're fighting about, because those are the sorts of things we fight about, and the gods are like us in relevant ways. So far, he's gotten Euthyphro to admit that the pious and the impious are opposites. The gods are fighting with one another about these kinds of things. Now here's the problem. Once Euthyphro's granted these points here, this runs into conflict with his second attempt at answering Socrates' initial question. His question was, what is the pious, what is the impious? And Euthyphro said, well, the pious is whatever the gods like, impious is whatever they don't. So again, because he's granted these things here, there's going to be a problem for that view. And here it is. Well, each god likes what it considers beautiful, good, and just, and each god hates what it considers ugly, bad, and unjust. But the gods disagree on these matters. We just saw that, right? Some like X, whatever you want to put in for X. Some of the gods like that, and some hate it. So that means that X is both hated and loved by the gods, since some like it and some hate it. So, in other words, the same things are both liked by the gods and hated by the gods. Why? Well, because they disagree with one another. Some of them like something and some of them hate it. Now, if that's so, then according to Euthyphro's second attempt, which claims that the pious is whatever the gods like and the impious is whatever they don't, the same things are both pious and impious. Let's go back to this last slide briefly. The upshot of all of this was that the same things are both liked by the gods and hated by them. But Euthyphro's saying, whatever the gods like is what's pious, and whatever the gods hate is impious. But if the same things are both liked by the gods and hated by the gods, then the same things are both pious and impious. I hope that reasoning follows. I'm sorry, I hope you follow that reasoning. If not, that might be something to talk about in the discussion post today, and one of your fellow classmates or myself will make an effort to answer it. And so do you see why this is a problem for Euthyphro's analysis of piety and impiety? His analysis has the conclusion that the same things are both pious and impious. I mean, that seems like a problem in itself, if that were the result. But there's also this. The conclusion that he's been forced into contradicts another point that you'll recall he granted to Socrates on one of those earlier slides, if you want to go back and look at it, and that's that the pious is the opposite of the impious. These concepts, piety or righteousness, impiety or unrighteousness, those concepts are opposites. So, if your analysis of those concepts leads you to the conclusion that the same things are both pious and impious, that seems like a problem because the same things shouldn't be, because those things are opposites. I hope that you've seen why that is a problem too. If not, you can talk about it in your discussion posts. So at this point, Euthyphro is frustrated, and he just says, all right, fine, but surely all of the gods agree about one thing, or at least one thing, and that's that what I'm doing right now in prosecuting my father for murder is pious. And so Socrates has two things to say about that. Okay, the first is that I need some kind of proof of that. Why do you think this? What reason do you have for believing that all of the gods definitely believe that this action of yours is right? I don't think you're going to be able to give me any such proof, and Euthyphro agrees. He says, that's a tall order, essentially. I don't know how I can prove that to you, but I just think that all of the gods would have to agree that this one action is pious. So that seems like an unsatisfying response, but more importantly, Socrates has another question, another response. He says, look, even if you could prove this to me, that all of the gods agree that this action of yours is pious, you wouldn't have answered my question. All you would have done would be to show that your particular action is pious, but as we saw with your first attempt at an answer to my question, where you defined piety just in terms of what I'm doing right now, prosecuting my father, we already saw that that kind of response doesn't tell me what piety and impiety are. It just gives me an example of the pious. So in other words, suppose, Socrates says, suppose I grant you that all of the gods agree that what I'm doing is pious, that what you're doing is pious. I don't know that I should grant you that because you haven't given me a proof of how you could know that. But suppose I do grant you it. Still, we're not in any better of a position now to determine what piety is, because you're basically just falling back on a particular example. It doesn't tell me in general what it means for an action to be righteous. Surely, what it means for an action to be righteous or pious is not, to prosecute one's father for murder. That could be an example of it, but it's something more general than that, surely. Okay, so at this point, Socrates gives Euthyphro a suggestion. He says, well, maybe this is what you're meaning to say, is that, what all of the gods love, whatever they can all agree on, is pious, and whatever they all hate, whatever they can all agree that they hate, is impious. So now, some of the gods will love one thing, and others will hate it. So those kinds of things are neither pious nor impious. So anything they all agree on loving is pious. If there's any dispute among the gods, then it's neither pious nor impious. Socrates says, maybe that's what you mean, Euthyphro. And Euthyphro says, yeah, that's basically right, I guess. But then Socrates, of course, points out that this third attempt at answering Socrates' question has problems. So there's one very important problem that arises. And this is a problem that any account, any general account, would face if it's trying to claim that the pious is identical with what the gods love. And this problem has come to be known as the Euthyphro dilemma. It's called the Euthyphro dilemma because it's named after this character Euthyphro, and it's not named after him in a good way. The Euthyphro dilemma is a problem for Euthyphro's own view, so in this way Euthyphro's kind of lived on in infamy for having not the most coherent or best worked out view. So that's why it's got its name, of course. It's named after this character, and it's called a dilemma because, well, I guess we'll get to that in a second. I think I have a slide that deals with it, an explanation of why this is a genuine dilemma, or what we mean when we say it's a dilemma. But first, just to state what the dilemma is, this is, I want to look it up. I'll tell you, in the book, it's on page 11, and it's at line 10 on the right. On the right margin, if you look, there are numbers just indicating as a point of reference so that we can all know where we're at. They've put numbers in the margins, and so if you look at line 10, that's right where it starts. And what Socrates says is this. He asks Euthyphro, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious? Or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? So those are two different possibilities. It's really important that you see that. The first option here, okay, before we get to the or, this horn of the dilemma, this first horn or first option, claims that an action is pious. I'm sorry, it claims that a pious action is loved by the gods because it's pious. That's why the gods love it. So that's one possibility. The second possibility is that an action is pious because it is loved by the gods. In other words, what makes an action pious or righteous is that it's loved by the gods. This first option, on the other hand, doesn't say that an action is pious because it's loved by the gods. It says that the gods love it because it's already pious. So you might want to pause the video at this point to review what I just said, because it's a little tricky just the way that it has to be phrased. It's unfortunate. I wish there were a better way of putting the point. It sounds repetitive, having to say the word pious like 12 times in order to express or explain what the dilemma consists of. But I think I said it as clearly as one possibly can. It's just that you might want to pause it and listen to that one or maybe even two more times. But I will be talking quite a bit more about what the dilemma means, and especially in the next lecture, I'll kind of rephrase it in a way that I think will be more helpful. So here's why this is a dilemma. Well, it's got two and only two choices. That's one characteristic of a dilemma. There are two ways of answering the question, and only two. Euthyphro, or anybody who believes that there's a tight-knit connection between piety and what the gods love, has to answer this question and has to choose one and only one of those two options. They can't choose both. I'll talk about why that is later on. And they can't choose neither because it's got to be one of these two. And another reason that it's a dilemma is because both of the choices are unattractive. So whether we go with the first option or the second, we've got a problem. It's a different problem depending on which option we choose. So if we choose option 1, we've got a problem. If we choose option 2, we've got a different problem. So here's the dilemma again, just for your reference. And here are the two options. Here's a way of putting it. So one option is that a pious action, take a particular pious action, X, a righteous action, say saving a person's life. That's something presumably that the gods love, if they all love anything. So a pious action, X, is pious because the gods love it. What makes it pious or righteous for me to, for instance, save a person's life? Well, just that the gods would love it or approve of it. On the other hand, it might be that the gods love a pious action X, like saving a person's life. The reason they love it is because it's pious. It's already pious, independent of what the gods love. It's just that it happens to be a fact about the gods that they love anything that's pious. But their loving it doesn't make it pious. Okay. And here they are again, these two ways of putting the options that the dilemma presents you with. For reasons that we'll talk about later on, Socrates thinks that option 2 has to be right. It can't be option 1. It can't be that what makes an action pious is the mere fact that the gods love it. Okay. Rather, the relationship between what the gods love and piety has got to be something more like 2. That certain actions are pious or righteous, and something else makes them pious or righteous. It has nothing to do with the gods. However, the gods will just love whatever is pious or righteous. However, if the relationship between the piety of an action and the gods' love of it is only that the gods love pious actions because the actions already are pious, then Euthyphro hasn't succeeded in telling us anything about the nature of piety. He's just said, well, here's an interesting fact about the gods. They're built in such a way, or they're the kind of beings that love pious actions. That's just a feature about the gods. It's not the cause of the righteousness of the actions. But that's exactly what Socrates wanted to know. He wanted to know what the nature of piety is. What is it that makes something pious or righteous? But if it's not option 1 that explains the relationship between what the gods love and what's pious, if it's not that, and Socrates thinks it can't be, then Euthyphro, in talking about what the gods love as an answer to Socrates' question, he hasn't told us anything about what it is that makes an action pious, or what's common to all pious actions. Saying that here's something that's common to all pious actions, the gods love them, Socrates is saying that's not the right kind of answer, because that's just an effect of an action's being pious. Pious actions turn out to be the ones that the gods love, but the gods loving them isn't the reason why they're pious. Okay, and then the dialogue basically ends with Socrates pressing Euthyphro for yet another attempt to answer his question. And Euthyphro basically just says, I gotta go, see ya. So Socrates is upset by this. It's sort of a funny way for the character to exit. He's just embarrassed about his incompetence, or he's frustrated with this annoying guy Socrates pressing him on this, for this philosophical discussion that he didn't really realize he was getting himself into. So that's it. At least that's the summary I wanted to give of what's going on in the Euthyphro dialogue. you need to make sure that you stay tuned for the second part of this lecture, and the reason is that, well, I mean, you need to watch all the lectures just for your comprehension in order to do well in the course, but in particular, in the second lecture, I'll be talking quite a bit more about stuff that you'll need to really be up on in order to write your paper well. In particular, although we've finished talking about the dialogue now, I'm going to bring this material to bear on a more general theory of the source and nature of right and wrong, and that's called divine command theory. And if you look at the prompt for your paper topic, you'll see that I'm asking you not only to talk about the Euthyphro dilemma as it's presented in this dialogue, which we have finished covering, but I'm also asking you to relate it to this theory, which isn't contained in the dialogue itself. So you'll need to pay careful attention to the second part of the lecture in order to even answer that question, in order to even complete that part of the paper. Okay, I guess I'm going to wrap this up then and take a quick break and then start the second part of the video and upload that. So stay tuned, and I'll see you guys later.